So do I think that blockchain will be used more and more? Absolutely. But equally, I don't know if it's the end all be all technology because there's a lot of other things we need to think about, like, quantum cryptography is also, and quantum computing is evolving so rapidly.
Welcome to the Origin podcast, and today we have the pleasure to meet Elise Soucie. She has been working for the FCA and now she's leading a non-profit organization about blockchain adoption. Elise, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome to Origin podcast. You told me that it is not the first podcast.
No, it isn't. But this is the first podcast actually that I'm doing where I'm just talking about myself and my journey, whereas usually I'm talking about all things financial services, digital money, policy and regulation. So I'm excited.
So what I propose you today is we are going to do it in two parts. We are going to talk about your professional background, but also what you are doing currently. And then I propose you also that we talk about your hobbies, childhood, teenagers, university, and other stuff like this.
Sounds good.
Sounds good for you? Do you live in London?
I do. So I lived in London. Now I just got my indefinite leave to remain, actually, so I can stay here permanently.
Okay.
I also lived in Paris for a couple of years, but I'm from outside of Chicago originally in the countryside.
You're from the US?
Yes, I grew up in the US.
Raised and born in the US?
Completely.
Why did you choose to move to Europe?
So it was actually when I was in university, and I will say, so on my dad's side of the family, they're French Canadian. My mom's side of the family is Belgian.
Okay.
And I'd always had an interest in learning French. My grandparents spoke French, even though my parents don't.
Okay.
And so when I was in university, I studied France, and I had the opportunity to study abroad. And so I did a whole year at Sciences Po in Paris, and I loved it.
Okay.
And I also stayed the summer before and the summer after. And then when I went back to the US and I was living and working there, I just really missed living in Europe. And so I decided I would take a year out, come to the UK and do a master's. And then I started working here, and I've been here ever since.
Excellent. And so that's why you are speaking French.
Yes,
currently.
but though very badly now.
No, why? Because you don't practice that much?
Yes, exactly. I should practice more. I really should.
But with a family from Canada and from Belgium?
Well, and so actually my future soon-to-be sister-in-law, she's French. So if she listens to this, Penelope, I will practice more with you. I'm sorry.
So you have been living in different cities and countries. Do you have a favorite one?
Oh, that's a really good question. So my favorite place that I've lived now is definitely England. So I love living here. And actually, I'm going to probably be moving to the countryside soon with my husband, which is where my in-laws live. I grew up in the countryside. And so even though I travel a lot for work and I go to a lot of quite big cities, I do really I love going to the countryside, walking, being in nature. I find it really grounding. So I would say that England is probably now my favorite place that I've lived. But in terms of favorite places that I've been or stayed, I love Madeira in Portugal.
Okay.
Beautiful, amazing place. And I would like to spend more time in Japan. I've only been there once, but I would love to explore it more.
And what about the US? Why you decided to leave the country?
So, to be honest, I mean, it was more about the opportunities that presented themselves to me at the time. So I did bear in mind, I did love, growing up in the US. And I know you said we'll talk about childhood later, and I had a great childhood there. But, as I said, I wanted to go back to Europe. And I was at the time working at a think tank doing counterterrorism research.
Okay.
And so your options are kind of, you stay at the think tank or you go to DC and you work at an agency there, CIA, that sort of thing. And I wasn't totally sure that was for me. I was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do at the time. And so hence why I decided to take a year out to figure it out, and thought, what better place to figure it out than Europe? And then when I was living in London for that year, and then I eventually got a job working in regulation, I just really, that was kind of what set me on my current career path. And so I just followed that. I wouldn't say there was this big strategic plan for me to leave the US. It was more just I kept taking the opportunities, and the opportunities that presented themselves kept being in London.
And do you think that you have been catching the unique British accents? At some point?
No.
I don't feel it.
Not at all. I still have such an American accent. I don't think I'll ever lose it. I mean, I know I say some words a little bit differently. or I say just different words because I've picked them up. Like I say aubergine instead of eggplant,
Yeah.
or like, courgette instead of zucchini.
Yeah, or sneakers and
Yeah,
shoes,
exact
no?
trainers, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. But I think that I will always probably sound American. You're welcome to come back and contact me on that if I start to sound British in like 10 years.
Yeah, maybe. And simple question, who you are and what you are doing.
So Elise Soucie Watts. I am the exec director at Global Digital Finance, and I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Outside Context. But my main day job is at Global Digital Finance, or GDF, and it's a nonprofit industry association. So essentially, if you know trade associations in the TradFi space, so there's ADAN in France, or in the UK, we have SIFMA. Sorry, SIFMA's in the US, but ICMA is that sort of thing where you basically get a bunch of firms together and try to form consensus across industry. And what we are is we're an open innovation community, and we try to be that bridge between the public and private sector. So basically, we have policy and regulatory work we do, as well as we look at solving challenges within the digital finance industry. And so on practical day-to-day basis, that means, if new legislation comes out about stable coins, crypto and digital assets, and a lot of times regulators will consult on that regulation. So if, MiCA in the EU, we then respond, but not just as us or just my opinion. We try to get those opinions from across all of industry. So talking to some of our members like Fireblocks, from PayPal to R3 to some of the banks, all the way through to, companies like Hedera, and really quite broad across the financial services industry, including with law firms and consultancies. And we will then form a kind of broad industry opinion to feed back to regulators and say, this is what works. This is what doesn't work. Here's what you need to know about the technology. Because if you think about it from the perspective of a regulator, which is what I used to do here in the UK, I was at the FCA, they're not in industry. They're not using these technologies on the day-to-day basis. And it's so important to have that public-private sector collaboration so that, we can really build better future-proof regulatory frameworks that are really fit for purpose with the tech. I will say the other half of what my organization does is more focused on business and use case. That's not what I run. I run the policy and reg side. But my colleague, Madeline, she runs a bit of work, which is all around, testing protocol interoperability, looking at digital custody, tokenization, but on the business use case side. But that is, my day job in a nutshell.
And when we are talking about digital finance, are we only and exclusively talking about cryptocurrency, blockchain, distributed ledger? Or
no, not exclusively.
There is a broader spectrum.
We do touch a bit on AI as well, and we've been looking at that, especially as part of the work that IOSCO is doing. So, the global, they sit over like all of the securities regulators, and they've been doing a lot of looking at AI usage in financial services. We also look at, retail, investor, online safety, that sort of thing. So it is quite broad, but we're guided by our members. So we have about 60 to 70 members, and basically we ask them every year what they would like us to focus on. And lately that has been digital assets, crypto, DLT, though obviously a bit of AI as well. And I think also a little bit around operational resilience and cybersecurity as well. But we're guided by their priorities.
And you are proposing a membership within your nonprofit organization, like are we talking about companies, individual?
Yeah, it's companies usually. So basically it's an annual membership, and firms can choose to be a part of it. And then when they are, they can participate in all of those policy and regulatory working groups to respond to consultations, and then also participate in a lot of those reports or sandboxes or other, engagements that we do based around that work. And then, but it's firms. I mean, we do have some, for example, like private consultants who choose to get engaged as well. But for the most part, it's companies. But anywhere from, pre-seed all the way through to big institutions.
Okay. And why did you decide to go non-profit?
Well, that's a good question because, again, as I would say, I don't ever feel like I've actually been super strategic about my career. I just kind of have taken what seems like a good opportunity. And so I definitely didn't choose it intentionally. When I was at the FCA still, I was approached by a recruiter. And actually, before I worked at this nonprofit, I worked at a different nonprofit, which was called AFME, the Association for Financial Markets in Europe. And that was only on the capital market side. So wholesale, working with the big banks and looking at digital assets and data policy for them. And a recruiter approached me about that role. And so that's how I ended up in the nonprofit space. But the nonprofit space is then very big once once you're in it. And the current chairman of my board, when he then recruited me for the role that I'm in now, he just thought that it would be a good fit for me. And honestly, it has been. I really genuinely enjoy it. I like being able to work with a broad range of firms, which is one advantage of being at a not-for-profit instead of at just one firm, because you get to see what's happening across the whole of the ecosystem.
Okay.
But also it puts you in a really kind of great neutral position where you can work with regulators and you're not sort of putting on a brave face because you don't want them to fine you or something, and you're not in a position of a startup where you're having to pitch all the time and do a lot of raises. You can kind of take a bit more of a big picture objective view, and I really like that about the not-for-profit space, because you really do get to kind of sit in the middle of what's happening in industry, in the middle between the public and private sector, and be that intermediary, which I find really fun.
And how do you sustain financially these non-profit organizations? Through memberships? Or
So the members pay an annual fee, which is a pretty standard structure for not-for-profits. So basically, depending on how big the firm is, members will pay a different amount, and depending on how involved they want to get. But we scale that and try to make it really, really affordable for, like, if you're a pre-seed firm, we don't expect you to pay as much as a law firm. So but they pay the annual fee, and then that goes to the salaries of the team, as well as a little bit on travel, but mostly that just goes to pay our salaries and help sustain the work that we do to convene everyone.
And do you have some subvention also from different organizations such as the government? Or
Nope, we're not subsidized at all. So it's and honestly, this is where we're very grateful for our members, and that they see the value in what we do. They see the value in working together, and we are always very, very grateful for them supporting us in the work that we do. So.
Okay. Can you talk about the type of companies that are registering within your membership system?
Yeah, so it is, as I said, this is what I think makes us unique as an organization, is because we have a narrow policy focus. So it really is looking at that digital finance, not everything in financial services, and not everything digital either. We don't really go beyond financial services in the work that we do. So the policy work and the work of the technical programs and innovation, it's very focused in on, looking at digital assets, stablecoins, crypto, as we said. However, the members are very broad. So we have banks. So your very traditional banks that you would think of. We have very traditional sort of law firms as well. We have some of the consultancies, some of the big fours. We have some of the new kind of companies in the crypto space, wallet providers, for example. We have stablecoin issuers. We have layer 1 blockchains. We have some of the smaller startups. We have analytics providers. So it really is quite broad range. I would say, honestly, you could pick almost any type of company in the crypto and digital asset space, and we probably have a member like that. I obviously don't have the whole list off the top of my head, but it is very broad, and I think that also helps when you think about the work that we do, because you're not just trying to look at policy from the perspective of what works for one type of firm. It really has to work across the whole of the ecosystem.
Absolutely. And in your opinion, what is the current state of art of blockchain adoption within Europe today? We know that in the US, it's a complete different story. Now we have a pro-crypto president. We have also an ETF approval also as well, and more financial institution adopting blockchain and crypto as a technology, but also as a financial asset for the Bitcoin, for instance. How do you feel? What's your perception in Europe?
So I feel like Europe is actually in a pretty good place. And I mentioned MiCA earlier as well, and DORA, the AI Act. The EU has been very quick to get regulatory frameworks in place when it comes to crypto and digital assets. And that has actually been a real strength, because if you think about what firms need to scale, they need regulatory clarity and legal certainty. And it's very hard to build a business if you don't know if you are regulated or not, if you don't know what legal requirements you have to adhere to. And so the fact that the EU has been able to roll out a really comprehensive framework has been fantastic for the industry. And I think that, yes, obviously there is kind of that pro-crypto momentum in the US at the moment. However, they still don't have as comprehensive of a regulatory framework as the EU does. And so you do see a lot of firms going to set up in the EU, applying for their MiCA licenses, and I think that is really a good thing. So I think that the EU definitely has done a lot of good, and of course MiCA isn't perfect. There are some things that people don't like about it, but in general, I think they've done a good job. I would section off the UK from that a little bit, because the UK does not have MiCA, does not have a comprehensive framework like the EU does. FCA have set out their crypto roadmap. But that likely won't be a fully fledged framework until 2026.
Okay.
So that's a little
Yeah.
bit later. And I
Yeah.
think it'll be very interesting to see where firms choose to, have their home base and to grow and build, because ultimately, I do think that this is a growing and scaling market. You don't just see, crypto and native and DeFi players. You also see big banks like Societe Generale Forge who have, set up literally an entire arm devoted to this. And so it is going to grow and scale. And I think if the EU and Europe in general can harness that, there's a lot of capital and growth, and it could really stimulate and drive growth in the economy at a large.
And do you think that we know that we have the MiCA law, everything has been implementing like very quickly. We are seeing more and more startups and companies operating from Europe directly. Societe Generale is a good example also as well. Do you think that we are still behind the United States in terms of blockchain adoption, or maybe other countries such as, I don't know, in Asia?
So, I don't know, actually. I don't know if the EU is necessarily behind in blockchain adoption. I would say that what the EU and the UK both need is more investment.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the private equity venture capital money is in the US. And I think that because of the way that some EU regulation is structured, especially in terms of technological sovereignty. So, if you look at like cloud providers, they want cloud providers to have everything like based in the EU if they're offering those services to EU businesses and citizens, for example. Some of those kind of things that are designed to protect EU sovereignty actually keep some of the capital investment out because of what you have to comply with. And so I actually think that blockchain adoption is really pushing ahead in the EU, and I don't think they're necessarily behind the US. I just think they need to drive more investment and create those investment and growth opportunities. I think that the other thing I would say about this is when we think about blockchain adoption, at least when I do, it's not just about adoption within one sector, within financial services, even though that's what I focus on. You do need to have it more widely across the rest of the economy, across other industries, but especially in the public sector. And I've not actually seen many governments do this super successfully yet, but like regulators should be using blockchain and implementing it internally as well. Governments should be implementing it internally. And I don't think that we see that in Europe yet. I think, regions to watch, at least in my opinion, for example, are like the UAE. Dubai and Abu Dhabi have been extremely tech forward, not just in their private sector, but in their public sector as well. And I think more of that in Europe could really help.
Okay. And do you see any countries also in Europe in which they are more blockchain friendly?
Well, I mean, Switzerland is an easy one. They were some of the first. Obviously, they have Zug and the Crypto Valley. When I hear from, industry anecdotally is that people do kind of look to France. They have been one of the leaders on this, which has been, interesting. And they have sort of, first kind of get everything in place for MiCA. The ACPR and the AMF recently did a great kind of working group and study on DeFi and smart contract audit and assessment. And I think they're some of the first to be really thinking about that. So I think, France has definitely been seen as a leader. Germany as well, unsurprisingly, especially given that they're a financial center.
Portugal also as well.
Portugal too. I know a lot of firms are, I actually know, weirdly, a lot of people are moving to Portugal at the moment, not just in crypto, but they've made it very easy to do that. Luxembourg is also somewhere that people have looked. So I would say those are some of the ones that immediately come to mind as front runners in Europe for sure.
Okay.
And Amsterdam, I would say as well, can be a hub. So.
Were you involved, you or your organization, or you and your organization within the MiCA law engineering?
So, very, very good question, actually. So I wasn't at my current organization for most of the MiCA process. Well, actually, I mean, this is how long MiCA has been going on, because they really did start on this a while ago. So when MiCA was first proposed and being looked at, I was at the FCA. So I was at the UK regulator, so I was not involved because this was post-Brexit. So the UK wasn't involved in that. However, we were still watching it with a lot of interest. And the UK was sort of thinking, what can we learn from what the EU is doing? This was, as you know, with EU law, it sort of starts in the parliament, and then obviously at the level 1 text, and then you have the level 2 with the, the RTSs, the technical guidelines. So when it first was proposed and being discussed, I was at the FCA, so I wasn't involved. When I then moved to AFME, I was involved and we fed back as it was actually going through Parliament. We were writing to various MEPs who we knew were involved in the drafting process, and that's very standard. That's kind of what happens. Industry feeds in. So yes, I did feed in as part of that process. Obviously, I wasn't in Brussels myself, so I wasn't doing any of the drafting, but we did feed in and I fed in on behalf of the banks. So it was very much a bank's perspective on how will MiCA affect us, which if you think about the fact that MiCA is meant to be complementary to the MiFID framework, which banks have to adhere to. A lot of the banks, they were really what they were focused on is like they didn't want it to be too different to MiFID because they were like, that makes it really complicated from a compliance perspective. If you're a startup, though, and you've never had MiFID applied to you, MiCA looks really terrifying and like so much to comply with. But yes, during that time of the process, I was involved then. And now that I've been at GDF for almost 2 years, that's been focused on these RTSs, the technical standards and guidelines, and the level 2. And now, obviously, we're moving to an implementation phase. So yes, I have been involved. If anyone is interested, we have on our website, you can read actually all of our consultation responses and things that we fed in on and where we were like, this works, this doesn't, this needs more clarification. So yeah, have been involved throughout that process, and it's been really, really interesting to see how it's evolved.
And is MiCA a tax law in which the UK has been involved also as well, or they have their proper MiCA regulatory framework?
Sorry, for which? The
UK.
Oh, the UK.
I'm asking the question because of the UK being out of the
European Union. UK is going to do something totally, well, not totally different. And honestly, I think at this point, people hope it's not too different. So the UK, basically, they're doing something different. So while in the EU, they said at the outset, here's MiCA. This is everything it covers, and this is the whole framework, and this is the level 1, and now we move to level 2. The UK has done it in bits and pieces. So first they did a little bit on financial promotions. Then they are just closed a consultation on market abuse. They've done a couple consultations on stable coins. We're waiting for the next phase on stable coins. So it's a bit more ad hoc, and they've been focusing on it piece by piece. And that's why I said earlier, we'll get maybe this full framework in 2026, because instead of doing one big framework, they're doing pieces of the framework at a time. So it's going to be a different approach, and it will look different to MiCA. So I wish I could say exactly what it will look like, but I don't know yet.
What are the goals of MiCA?
So, making sure that crypto and digital assets are brought within the regulatory perimeter in the EU, making markets safer, so consumer protection, but also protection from a financial stability perspective. Also, I do think growth was an incentive there as well, and they did want to make sure that this was a place where crypto and digital assets could grow and scale in the EU. But really, if you think about objectives, it's going to be very similar to what are the European Supervisory Authority objectives on everything else, which is really protect the markets, protect the consumers, and make sure that, that the regulators have the authority and the powers to make sure that markets are safe and orderly. Yeah. And that applies to crypto and digital asset markets as it does to financial markets.
I'm very interested about your perspective about this, because me personally, I'm pro MiCA, because I think that the regulatory framework in which everyone can find an understandable state of art about how to adopt blockchain within governments, company, is where the future is going about this adoption. But at the same time, if we are looking at the Bitcoin or crypto asset maximalist, MiCA law is against the initial philosophy of the blockchain network, which is about to be anonymous, to be fully decentralized, not to rely on any entities, not to do KYC. So what is your perspective about this dualism, I would say?
So this is a fair question. I am probably the wrong person to ask if you want to kind of like DeFi maxi answer on this, because I obviously have worked in policy and regulation for years. So I am very much on the side of, I believe that if you have a financial service or a product, it should be under financial services regulation. Yeah. And there's reasons for that. The great financial crash is that was a great example of what happens when you don't have great regulation and when you don't have the appropriate oversight on certain things. And now I know the Bitcoin maxis would be like, yes, but Satoshi Nakamoto wrote this as a response to the great financial crisis, and Bitcoin could be a solution against that. And I don't disagree that some decentralization and some more transparency could be incredibly helpful. However, realistically, I don't think we're moving away from financial regulation
Yeah.
anytime soon. And
Yeah.
I don't think we're moving to a fully decentralized financial services world. And so
Okay.
I agree. I think that MiCA and also most regulatory frameworks are net good.
Okay.
I get that there's challenges. I get that it's stressful and it's very difficult for firms to sometimes comply and that some of the requirements might be unclear. But
Yeah.
overall, regulation is a net good. And I think that it's very important to ensure the safety, security, and stability of markets. What I would say is that you mentioned KYC, for example. I also think we're very far from a world where we can have completely anonymous anonymity in financial services. But that isn't to say that privacy isn't important. And so, for example, I think once we develop wider adoption of a digital ID that is accepted globally, so not a digital ID that you can use in DeFi, but a digital ID that you can also use when you go to the airport, when you need to verify yourself at the front of a building, when you're applying for a job, that kind of digital ID where it's widely accepted and in financial services, then maybe we can start talking a bit more about anonymity and privacy and like, do you actually need to disclose your full name for these things? Or is it just enough for them to check, with zero knowledge proofs?
Yeah.
Are you sanctioned?
Yeah.
Have you committed a crime? How old are you? That world is a future world that I think we can absolutely build for, but we're not there now. And I think the solution is not just to say, well, let the crypto markets be unregulated until we have great digital ID.
So in these regulated countries, Europe, US, etc., I think you are right. We are moving into a more regulatory approach. Do you think that we will have some hybrid approach, like to let the maxis to operate without any KYC, but at the same time to have countries in which there is strong regulation? Maybe we will see some DeFi protocols that will be existing forever in some what we call paradis fiscaux in France, Bahamas, this kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah. So actually, let me unpack that a little bit, because if you think about actually what MiCA did, DeFi is not included in MiCA. It is out of scope intentionally. So actually, the EU didn't regulate the DeFi market, which is a really interesting choice, and one I actually frankly agree with, because I think the market is still evolving and a lot of the products don't necessarily look like financial products or services. However, I will come back to it, which is, if it is a already regulated financial product or service that you're just doing in a decentralized way, if it is a bond, if it is a security, if it's a money market fund, you cannot simply go and do that and be like, well, I'm doing it in DeFi, so it's therefore not regulated. That's just not how financial markets work. And you're never, frankly, going to get the scale and the growth that you need to be in those markets if you don't comply with the appropriate regulation. So set that aside. However, there was a very interesting consultation from IOSCO maybe a year and a half ago that was on DeFi specifically. And one thing we pushed back on very heavily was where you have a DeFi protocol that is not a product, or you have just developers who are working on these protocols, those should not be regulated as financial services, because they could, you can build what you want on top of them, and it should be at the level where you're providing the financial product, activity, or service, and the person that is then providing that product or service where the regulation comes in, not across the whole. I mean, think about it this way. If you were a bank, you're not responsible if BT internet goes down. Do you need to have operational resilience measures in place if the internet goes down? Sure.
Makes total
sense. But the regulators won't fine you if the internet goes down and people can't access their banking apps.
Yeah.
And similarly, I don't think we should be regulating the underlying decentralized technology. Instead, you need to regulate where the actual products are being offered.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk also about the SEC perception also. Before Trump and after Trump. SEC has been always considering, to some extent, Bitcoin and Ethereum as securities. Now they are stating that it is commodities. What is the perception in Europe about these two big digital assets?
So, a good question. And actually, what I would say is that, yes, while the tone has certainly shifted with the SEC, that we are still waiting to see exactly how everything will be regulated. So basically, if you remember last year, there was a bill that was proposed called Fit 21. It didn't end up passing, but that was all about market structure and how the crypto and digital asset market will be structured and regulated. We're now waiting on the new market structure bill to come out of the US. That hasn't been proposed yet. Right now they're working on stable coins, but market structure will be next.
Okay.
And that will give a lot more clarity. But yes, we've already had a tone shift, and it's great to see what the SEC is doing, that they're engaging with industry, they're having roundtables. This is really like wonderful. In terms of like the European perception of this though, and when it comes to things like, you know, Bitcoin and Ethereum, as I said, I mean, the UK is still finding its way in terms of like how things will exactly be regulated. But I think in the EU with MiCA, they're not going to change MiCA just because the SEC changes their mind. But also important to note here, and this is a specific nuance of like US regulation, is that the US definition of security is a little bit different than how other markets think about securities as well. And so that kind of security commodity divide is not necessarily something other markets always have to worry about, because they apply their regulation differently, and regulation is structured differently in Europe and in Asia as well than it is to the US. So special little nuances of US regulation in some ways.
You have been talking also about stable coins a few times. I think it's a key word in today's financial world. We are talking about this private issued type of stable coin, like the one by Tether, Cycle, etc. But we have now also the concept of central bank digital currency. I talk a lot about the US because I'm really informed also what's happening in the US, so always an element of comparison for me. But do you think that the European Commission or Europe is going into a central bank digital currency or private issued stable coins, or both?
So for Europe, it's going to be both.
Okay.
And the EU, and you know, I've had recent conversations that they are very clear that they're going ahead with the digital euro regardless of what's happening in the US, because this comes back to them for monetary sovereignty. And if you think about it, in my opinion, CBDCs kind of get a bad rep because people are like, oh my God, government control. This is horrible. How scary. I think what people don't realize is that we already have multiple forms of money that exist in our monetary system today. We have central bank money, which is from the central bank. AKA, if you go and you have a euro, this is money issued by the central bank. And we have commercial bank money, which is bank deposits. And that's if, you know, you send a transaction from, you know, say your Lloyd's banking app to Barclays, that's commercial bank money. These are bank deposits. And yes, on a day-to-day, the everyday consumer doesn't think about that much. But then if you think about what's happening at the capital markets level with capital markets settlement, when big banks are settling their wholesale transactions, they're settling where practical and available according to the PFMI principles in central bank money. And there's already forms of digital central bank money. We're just not calling them a CBDC, but these are these big settlement systems like the RTGS system in the UK. That settlement is already occurring in central bank money. So CBDC is actually not that crazy of an idea if you think about it, especially for capital markets. It's just the next evolution in how we use central bank money versus commercial bank money. That being said, a stable coin would then be a new form of, in my opinion, commercial bank money. Unless, of course, you have a stable coin issued by a government, which is totally a different thing. We can maybe get to that later, but that would be different. But a privately issued stable coin, like the ones that you've mentioned, that is a new form of commercial bank money. Why is it different? Because it's a bearer instrument. So if it's appropriately backed and regulated. So that means that instead of being essentially an IOU, which is what a deposit is basically a debt, a stable coin has an underlying backing asset, meaning when you transfer the stable coin, you also transfer directly the ownership of the asset. You're not transferring that ownership when you have a bank deposit because it's an IOU. There's not that underlying asset. And so I guess what I would say is for stablecoins, I think it's a really unique opportunity to expand and diversify commercial bank money, have commercial bank money be more programmable. And yes, there's the argument you can do this with tokenized deposits as well. That's like what JP Morgan is doing with Onyx, et cetera. And other banks are looking at tokenized deposits too. But stablecoins, I think, will be something that is quite unique and will continue to grow. And to come back to your original question, in Europe, I think we absolutely will have both. the EU has been very clear about this. Digital euro, they believe in it. They want to keep going with it. And for wholesale purposes, they've done some very interesting trials recently as well, the ECB trials on wholesale settlement. So I think they will go ahead with that. But you can already have stablecoins under MiCA. So they already are doing stablecoins too. So it's both.
Can you quote private or public companies that you know in Europe, for instance, that will be issuing this CBDC and these stablecoins? I know that Quant Network, this London-based company with Gilbert Verdian, is also working hard also on the CBDC adoption in the UK.
So, I mean, well, for CBDC, that's easy. It will be the central banks. So, I mean, that's like, and they are like working on the digital euro. And you can look at actually what I would encourage everyone to go look at is, look at, Banque de France, Bundesbank, look at the statements that they've made around digital euro. There are many of them. But also you can look at what's happening with the BIS, so the Bank for International Settlements. There's been a number of experiments that have taken place with central banks at using CBDCs and stablecoins. So have a look at that because it's very interesting and you can actually see what they've been evolving, developing, and rolling out. In terms of private companies, I mean, you already know the ones that are already listed in Europe and, Circle, USDC, Paxos, etc. However, the ones that I would say are interesting are ones where we haven't necessarily seen them issued yet. So there's a really interesting company that I've been watching in the UK called Agant, and they are looking to be the first GBP stablecoin. So because obviously, as you know, most stablecoins are now issued in the US dollar. That's why you have USDC, USDT, etc. They're all US dollar backed. But Agant is looking at this in the UK context. Obviously, pound sterling is still widely used around the world and traded in FX as well. And so they're looking to be the first GBP pound-backed stablecoin, which I think will be very interesting.
All right. How do you envision the use cases of DLT and blockchain adoption within Europe in the next 5 to 10 years? Maybe voting, maybe financial circulation, maybe luxury asset authentication. How do you see the spectrum of blockchain adoption in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think that for financial services, we're kind of already in the kind of scaling and transitional phase. If you've seen a lot of the acquisitions that have happening with stuff with like Stripe and Bridge, it's already on the up and up. And I think that will just continue. We'll see continued evolution and you will see digital assets and crypto becoming more day-to-day and standard in financial transactions. So much so that the retail consumer probably won't even notice, you know, like if you started to have something settled, if you went and paid and then the settlement that happened on the back end was in stable coins instead of your deposits, would you really notice? Probably not. No. And I think that's okay. And so as you say, I think that the more interesting kind of 5 to 10 years, we will see this in other industries as well. I think luxury goods is a great example of somewhere where for the authentication, verification, art, fashion, etc., will be very interesting to see how the digitization of that process, bringing it on chain, can be safe. And I think actually, in my opinion, the key there is not to make it a financial service product. Like actually using this technology for books and record keeping and verification and authentication is also a great use case. Absolutely. And there doesn't have to be that kind of financial scammy kind of thing that scares people away. Because I think what people in financial services, especially crypto and DeFi, need to realize is like the reason that people are worried and scared about this industry and this technology is because there have been a lot of scams. We have seen rug pulls. We have seen meme coins go wrong. And so if we want it to scale in other industries, it needs to be safe, secure, and not trying to just make a quick profit, but actually evolving the underlying system as we think about things like, smart cities and how we evolve even the kind of underlying infrastructure and fabric of city frameworks to be better. I think that will be very interesting to watch. And it doesn't have to not everything needs to be a financial product.
What you are saying is like we will be using blockchain technology, but the people and the citizen won't even recognize that they are using blockchain technology because it will be integrating within the technological framework.
Totally. Just like with cloud, I think, cloud adoption, is that most people don't know actually how much data is stored in the cloud or where it goes or how much of their data or when they use the cloud. maybe people think about it a little bit when they're like sharing photos and stuff and that sort of thing. But I think that cloud rollout happened, and now it is just part of the fabric of our day-to-day lives. And I think it will be similar with blockchain. And again, it will just have to kind of grow and evolve in that natural, organic way, but also in a safe way. And we need to have safe builders, and we need to make sure that those kind of critical privacy and security features are kind of baked in at the outset.
And you know, the blockchain maxi, and especially they are overly invested, I think, in some extent. They are telling like everything will be replaced with blockchain technology. I don't trust it. My question for you is like, do you think like blockchain will replace every existing and working technology, or it will be more on the plug and play side, or on another form?
Okay, well, I mean, it's hard to say because I definitely don't think that everything is going to be. I think what I would say is I often hear is like everything will be tokenized, and I'm like, okay, everything maybe doesn't need to be tokenized.
No, not my T-shirt.
No, maybe not. Yeah, exactly. Not everything. However, I do think that we are going towards a more and more digital future. And I think everything is becoming increasingly digitized.
Yeah.
When you think about everything becoming increasingly digitized, then you need to think about how to make it safe. And I think that actually DLT is a way we can make things more safe and more secure if it's implemented in the right way. And so do I think that blockchain will be used more and more? Absolutely. But equally, I don't know if it's the end all be all technology, because there's a lot of other things we need to think about, like, quantum cryptography is also, and quantum computing is evolving so rapidly. In a post kind of quantum world, or things that are, strong in a post quantum cryptographic world, maybe, but like blockchain technology looks a little bit different. And maybe this is just the next evolution in our tech stack. And I think that definitely some of the old ways of doing things will need to fade away. Like, I do think that we rely very heavily on a lot of paper-based processes at the moment for, as we say, like verification, and even things we talked about KYC earlier, having to send loads of physical documents. I did it when I had to get my indefinite leave to remain. You have to have like paper. You have to literally physically have your passport. All of these things, I think those can be actually enhanced and improved. But will it always be the blockchain? I'm not so sure. Maybe there's a new technology coming we don't know about yet.
I'm sure. Maybe the quantum one.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can have a 1 hour full dedicated podcast about this technology. It's crazy. One thing that I wanted to talk about before we go a little bit about yourself, your childhood, etc., it's about the place of the AI within this financial revolution. Like within your non-profit organization, like how do you see the AI in synergy with blockchain and DLTs?
So where we talk about this the most often is with payments and agentic AI, so AI agents. And that eventually our payment system will likely be upgraded, and that AI agents will be making payments on our behalf. So, for example, you maybe have an AI agent in your car, and an AI agent in your refrigerator, and an AI agent, I don't know, in your heating and electric. And we already have, for example, smart systems with like water and heating. So this is not actually that far away. But imagine, instead of you having to go in and manually check it and it giving like a report out to you, when you go up to the gas station, you fill your car up with gas, your AI agent just pays on your behalf, and it pays for you. But at the same time, maybe simultaneously, you've ran out of milk, and your AI fridge orders milk for you and pays on your behalf. When that's happening, and when we have hundreds of thousands of AI agents making these payments and micropayments all at once, it's very unlikely that our existing payment rails are going to be able to handle that volume of transactions. And so, therefore, I think this is where distributed ledger technology could then become increasingly helpful for not only recording those transactions, but helping to be that new post-trade infrastructure for settling and those payments as well and transacting. So that's, for me, where I see one of the most kind of key intersections. There's so many more we could talk about. There's 100,000 things you could use
that's
AI
so interesting.
for. But this is the one that I hear being discussed most frequently.
Okay. I discovered AI like two years ago with ChatGPT. Even if AI was from the 60s, 70s, 80s, but with the adoption of the generative AI, it changes the way we are working today. Yeah? I mean, I'm drafting my emails and my legals, my accountability, everything with ChatGPT today. It's crazy. And also from the software development, you were talking about AI agent. The things that I was able to do it in 1 month, I can do it in 2 days now with AI agent. Crazy the revolutions that we are facing.
Definitely.
I'm blessing. I'm very happy to live in this world.
Yes, no, it's a fun time to be alive.
No, absolutely. It's like an industrial revolution.
Yeah,
for me.
Absolutely.
I think we are seeing a big shift in the world and the way we are working also as well.
Definitely.
I'm seeing at Galileo the way that the employees are working is totally different today. They are learning how to pilot the AI.
Yes.
In comparison of implementing directly.
And this is so true, is that actually, and this is where I think it's interesting, and I mean, you know, I also use ChatGPT, but like, I think it'll be interesting to see how we as humans learn to interact with AI agents, because not all agents are the same, and not all AI agents have the same interface as ChatGPT either, and there are ways that we can learn to work with these models, and, you know, it's us that have to learn how to evolve in that instance as well, and so I think that's really fascinating.
Now I want to go back to you personally, who you are. You told me at the beginning of this interview that you have been grown and raised in the US. Do you have some memories or maybe very nice experiences that you would like to tell about your childhood and when you were in the US?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, I grew up in the U.S. I grew up in Illinois in a little town called St. Anne. It's about 2 hours south of Chicago. So very much countryside, cornfields, corn and beans. Those are the two main industries there. My dad is a farmer, so he actually has a flower farm. He grows flowers. And my mom was a teacher, so a middle school teacher. And, you know, childhood was very fun. I spent a lot of time reading as a kid. So contrary to being a farm kid, I also have a lot of allergies. So I was like not always super keen on doing like garden work, which you would think is like two parents who like love gardening and farming. I would like bargain with them and I would be like, you know, can I like read my book outside instead, like while you guys are, you know, picking the strawberries or whatever. And they were just, you know, this crazy kid.
Yeah.
But I spent a lot of time reading, and I think that maybe if you have any your US listeners might resonate with this, is like I actually didn't really travel that much outside of the US when I was a kid. We traveled a lot inside the US, so we would go to Florida for holidays in the winter because it gets very cold in Chicago in the winter. So we go to Florida for holidays, which I loved, and that was almost every year. And I had relatives in Minnesota, and we would go there for Christmas. But I didn't really travel outside of the U.S. The first time I left the U.S. was when I went to Mexico when I was 16 with my parents. So it's a very safe and secure holiday in Mexico, not like these crazy trips that you see people going on for spring break. And then the first time I ever came to Europe was when I moved to France, and I was only 20 at the time. And I moved to France, having never been to Europe, never been to the EU, never been to Paris, and just fully moved on my own. And so back to my childhood, what I would say is that, you know, it was really, I read a lot about these places that I would one day go. So I read about a lot of different countries. I loved history. I loved reading about, you know, ancient royals. So I read all about like Marie Antoinette and Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria, like their childhoods, and it fascinated me. I mean, we didn't have any like, you know, kings and queens in the US, and I always thought that was so cool that other countries did. And so, yeah, a lot of time reading. I also did quite a lot of like sports and activity and things like that. So I did horseback riding, ice skating, gymnastics, dance. I was doing a lot of activities as a kid. So a lot of reading and also a lot of activities.
Excellent. Can you tell us when you arrived in France, what was your perception? Maybe a shift in mindset, or maybe a shift in the way that we approach the culture, the life?
It was honestly, it was a really transformational experience for me in my life, and just like living in another country, seeing the differences in how people lived. This is like a kind of silly thing, but like when I lived in the US, I used to wear a lot of makeup, not a lot, but like the standard amount for someone who grew up in the US.
Yeah.
And like when I moved to France, I remember being like, all these women, like they're barely wearing any makeup, but like this is so, and it's just such a silly thing, but it really did, it influenced me. And I was like, wow, I was like, I just need to take better care of my skin. And like, I and that was like something that it really stuck with me and still has to this day. And I remember that. And I remember like marching off to like Monoprix to like go and get my little like under eye patches and get my skincare and things like that. But I loved it. It opened, up to, different foods. It was the first time I was able to travel around the EU and like so cheaply. And so I went everywhere. And I went to, a little bit more in Eastern Europe. I went to Brussels and Bruges. I went to Germany, all these places that I got to go for the first time. And it all happened when I had a home base in France. And so it will be very special to me, the time that I lived in Paris, because I did love it. And I think that for me, it showed that you can really learn different ways of seeing and approaching the world. And it kind of opened that up for me. And obviously now I live in Europe. So, but it really did. It really changed the way that I kind of saw the world and how I wanted to see my place in it.
Yeah. Les voyages forment la jeunesse, like Voltaire was telling,
Exactement.
I backpacked also 2 years in a different Southeast Asia country.
Wow.
And it opened my perspective so much.
Yeah.
About people, about finance, about religions, about cultures, etc.
Exactly.
I feel that I am way more open now than I was.
Definitely.
Yeah,
it's so important to be able to just see a different perspective. And it doesn't mean that you have to take every single thing about a different culture and be like, I'm going to do it exactly the way they do. But you can learn to think about things a different way, to approach things a certain way. Even when I was at Sciences Po, like the way university is structured is very different to the way it is in the US. And so, I was giving more presentations. Like that's something that you don't do a ton in the US, but as I'm sure you do a lot in France. And that for me, obviously, prepared me in some ways to do more public speaking and things like that as an adult, especially given that I was like so terrified having to give presentations in France to my French classmates. Like, and I was like, here I am, like an American, like rocking up in their class. So it was scary at times, but it really did. I loved it a lot. And it was a very special time for me. The friends that I have made when I was there, I'm still friends with. And yeah, it was a really, really great experience. And I'm always happy when I get to go back to Paris.
And you decided to study at Sciences Po.
Yeah.
Which is not the most easiest school.
No, it's not. It was challenging. And, but I would highly recommend it. And I highly recommend it for anyone who is thinking about going and like studying abroad. If you have the opportunity to go and do that in another language where you actually have to immerse yourself, not like studying abroad in France, still speaking your own language, but doing it in a much more immersive way, highly recommend. And even though like my French isn't what I would like it to be now, it was such a good experience. And I know I would have been nowhere near close to being able to get as good at the language skills. And actually my husband, he had a similar experience. He studied and lived both in Spain and Russia. And again, it's that kind of immersion where you're actually doing class in the language in the university with people that live there. I think it is a really great experience.
What was your purpose before integrating Sciences Po? Did you want to work within the administration side?
I wanted
politician side?
If any of my legal friends listen to this, I really wanted to be a lawyer.
Okay.
Which is so funny because now everyone asks me, are you a lawyer? Because I work so much on regulation. And I'm like, no, I'm not. But no, actually, and it's so funny actually, when I was in France, before I wanted to be a lawyer, study international law. And I thought, go to France, get a little bit of experience. I loved it there so much. And when I came back, I remember thinking, do I really want to go to law school for like another so many years, rack up more debt, etc.? I was like, why don't I just go get a job in Europe? But that hadn't occurred to me before I had lived abroad. I always thought like, oh, I need to like get a job in the US, and then maybe if I'm lucky, maybe then they'll let me travel. And then I was like, I don't need to do that. I can just move there. And I don't think I had that sense of you can just move places. You can just go to other countries. If you want to go. Yeah. And I didn't have that before I actually had the experience of it. And so but I wanted to be a lawyer.
Excellent. And then you arrived in UK.
Yep.
You worked within the FCA, which is the AMF in France.
It's AMF, like AMF, the Financial Conduct Authority, exactly.
And what was why did you integrate the FCA?
So, and I think, and maybe this would be a topic for another day, but I said it. So I used to work at a think tank doing counterterrorism research when I was in the US.
Yeah.
When I took a year out and I went to the UK, I was still studying the same thing: geopolitics, counterterrorism, security. But then I was like, well, I really love London. I'd like to stay here. Therefore, what jobs can I do? And so I started looking for jobs to apply to after my master's program. And I did need, however, to have a visa sponsorship. And so I had to look at any jobs that would sponsor by visa. And I actually did still look at jobs in France as well, because I was thinking about going back at the time. But the FCA came up because they sponsored visas. There was someone in my master's program, and she was like, hey, I'm applying to some jobs here. Like, you should have a look at it too. And so I did. Honestly, I didn't really know that much what the FCA was at the time. I was like, oh, it kind of seems like the SEC, but also not really. So I'm a little bit confused, but I was like, I'll give it a go anyways. And I applied to be in their cybersecurity kind of tech resilience and cyber program. So a little bit more similar to what I was doing, because I still got to look at, threat intelligence. When might banks be kind of under threat from, nation state actors? And especially I was involved in what was called their CBEST program, which is TIBER in the UK. And this is when the regulator mandates a penetration test of a bank's cybersecurity and operational resilience profiles. So I was involved in that. And that's how I ended up there. But it was, again, not super intentional. Like a lot of these things, I was like, that sounds like it could be an interesting job. Let's see if I'm able to do it. And it worked out.
And you developed an hobby for this regulation?
Yes, I guess you could say that. Is that I then, while working at the regulator, kind of learned a bit more and really did get passionate about why regulation is important, why it's needed in financial services. And then when I moved over to work in the international division, that was when I started working on digital assets. And really, that for me, when I started to see like, oh my goodness, there isn't any regulation for crypto and digital assets yet. Like this is just happening, but we don't have that framework yet. I think for me, the really exciting thing about regulation is when you are helping shape and build a regulatory framework. That sort of sets the stage for how financial services will evolve for years to come. We still look at the Basel standards, MiFID, like these things that were created years and years ago, now shape how businesses operate today. And so if we can do that for the crypto and digital assets industry, that's such an exciting way to be part of the evolution of financial services history. And so, yeah, I do really love it now.
And this expertise for the digital asset industry, did you develop it within the FCA?
So I did start working on one. Yeah. So when I was at the FCA, I worked a bit on their framework. But again, this was very early days. So they are much more advanced on it now than when I was there. But it was a very kind of start of looking at what a UK regulatory framework could look like.
Okay. Are you an investor within the crypto asset industry?
So I'm not an angel investor. I'm a little bit too early in my career for that. But I do have investments. I have a number of different types of investments, both in, traditional financial products, crypto assets, as well as I invest in wine as well.
Okay.
But what I would say is I am also on the board of a company. And so that is another way that I kind of get involved in that, and aside from my day job, of course. So yes, some investments. I'm much more of a holder, though. I don't do like crypto day trading. I don't have time. I don't have time.
Do you have a final remarks, stories that you would like to share?
I think maybe the main thing that I would say is, one, if you're thinking about making, a really big move or a really big change, be that in your career, your location, is that you should really just go for it.
Yeah.
And you can work out the details later. That is certainly what I did. And like, as long as you feel confident about what you're stepping into, you feel like it's something you'll be passionate about, then you should absolutely lead with that. The other, on more of a work side of things, is that, policy and regulation is genuinely really important for the future of this industry, and that even if you think it doesn't apply to me or that the rules are wrong, again, you should then work to change it and work to get engaged with it. And if you think that the rules applying to you aren't what they should be, this is our opportunity to set that up for the future. So those would be my last thoughts.
Élise, it was a great pleasure to talk to you. It was very interesting, and I feel your passion. Thank you so much for joining us for the Origin podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.